We are continuing off from last week where we had discussed how Europe underdeveloped Africa, chapter 1. Last week we looked at section 1, what is development. And today we are going to look at section 2, what is underdevelopment. So for those who were not here last week, the recording of last week's session is available on our YouTube page, and the recording for this session too will be made available soon after. So now let's dive in. So we are going to be looking at section 2, what is underdevelopment, as I said earlier. So just to go through a summary of the first chapter, what is development, we discussed last week that it is the increasing capacity or ability to win a living from nature. Every people have shown a capacity for independently increasing their ability to live a more satisfactory life through exploiting the resources of nature. As people develop their capacity and produce more to meet their needs, there are qualitative changes in how they organize, which in turn drives further development. Development is therefore not purely economic. Changes in economy lead to changes in organization of society, which in turn have an impact on economic development. Very crucial to the understanding of development is the characteristic of uneven development. Different societies don't necessarily develop at the same pace. When we looked at it, we looked at the case of Egypt, which was far advanced, of Europe and of course of other African countries at the time. And so it's just an example to show that societies can develop at different paces. They can go faster and they can go slower. But all societies develop. When we look specifically at European development, we have the pattern from communalism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism. And of course, now we are in the era of capitalism. So in these stages of development, every succeeding stage increased the productive capacity for some time, but became obsolete after a while. The subjugation of an exploited class defines the form of development of this development that we have seen in Europe. From slavery, a class was subjugated to feudalism and to capitalism. So that was the format for the European development. We look at Africa not having the same characteristics, or even Asia as such, though we have a bit of a mix over time of different characteristics like slavery and feudalism, but not capitalism in Africa. But certainly there was no full-scale development of any of these forms of European development in Africa. By subjugating a class, despite the fact that each stage is an improvement on the previous stage in terms of producing more for the population and technological advancement, the fact of it being based on the subjugation of a class leads to it regressing eventually and not being progressive anymore. And that's what we have seen throughout the stages. That capitalism was progressive at the stage, but by the full-scale development of capitalism, which led to the subjugation of the majority of the population of the world, the goods that capitalism can produce are not enjoyed by the majority of people, which leads to constant crisis for capitalism. And of course, capitalism has extended the exploitation to the globe. That subjugation, not just for the class of the working class people of the capitalistic countries in Europe, but across the whole world, not just after capitalism, because sometimes it is being said as if afterwards imperialism happened. Capitalism couldn't have happened without starting off with colonialism and with slavery. So slavery and colonialism enabled it to be able to produce cheaply, so for the markets that it was serving in Europe. So that is essential to understand. So we cannot speak of European development at all without speaking also of underdevelopment. European development means the underdevelopment for certain classes, the majority classes, and also of other nations that help to fuel capitalism to provide its cheap raw materials and cheap labor. So now let's jump into section 2. What is underdevelopment? So what is underdevelopment? As I said earlier, every people have developed everywhere in the world. So underdevelopment is not the absence of development. Basically, we look at underdevelopment comparatively. One society can be said to be less economically developed than another. Remember, we are looking at economic development. We are not looking at development completely. It's very important to note that when we discussed in chapter 1, we emphasize that economic is usually used as a measure of development, but it's not the only way you can measure development. And when we look at other aspects, we find that people who are less economically developed than others might be more greater developed in other aspects, whether in a social aspect, organizational aspect, and so on. To compare economically, we can compare the economic conditions at two different periods for the same country and determine whether or not it has developed. And more importantly, it is possible to compare the economies of any two countries or set of countries at any given point in time, any given period in time. Uneven development is a characteristic of economic development. So at certain periods, some societies can be more advanced in producing more and becoming more wealthy. So the first characteristic of underdevelopment is uneven development. Exploitation is the second key characteristic of modern underdevelopment. In terms of, we're looking at modern development and underdevelopment right now in the capitalist stage. And in this stage, it is a very connected world. So it is a world in which there's a lot of interactions and some countries are able to subjugate other countries. So it's an imperialistic world we're looking at. Asian and African countries were developing independently, but imperialism and colonialism led to their exploitation and exported wealth stolen from them, which we refer to as a surplus. It's a surplus because it's the capital required to develop the countries or the territories. It is the wealth that they would have had, if it was kept with them, but rather that what is now left is whatever they need to survive. So the surplus on top of just mere survival, basic survival, is taken out completely. So as you see in the graphs, $41 billion is estimated to be taken out of Africa every year. This is just an index. It's not even really going to tell the full story of what's taken out of Africa. This extracted wealth deprives the countries that is taken from of the benefits of their resources and their labor. And labor is an important part of the exploitation, because generally when we speak about this exploitation, we say, oh, the Europeans have come and outsiders have come and they have taken our resources. We always forget about the labor. The labor is actually an important part. It takes labor to extract the resources. So what the imperialists are doing are not just taking our resources, they are also exploiting our labor. a labor in which they don't pay, we don't get the value of what we put in. So for example, if you go to the Congo, you see the kind of labor that is involved in extracting the material that is in our mobile phones, including child labor and slave labor. But in other aspects across Africa, that is exactly what is happening. So do we say we are not underdeveloped? Is it going to offend sensibility? Should we rather say we are a developing nation? As if we just want to be nice with language, but that doesn't actually make any sense according to Rodney. Of course, we don't understand underdevelopment to mean that we are morally underdeveloped or socially underdeveloped or underdeveloped. We understand it strictly in an economic sense. If we look at it in a moral sense and look at a country like the USA, which is developed economically, we know it is underdeveloped morally. As Fela Kuti sang, the idea of civilization is the number of nuclear weapons you get, the amount of people you can kill, and we understand that that is not really civilized. So we don't mean underdevelopment in a moral sense, and it is the necessary term we have to use here rather than developing. Basically, we can't actually say that we are developing. Is Nigeria a developing country? No, because development suggests there is some improvement, when in reality there is not, and the level of underdevelopment is actually getting worse as the imperialist powers continue to intensify their oppression. So when we look at economic development then, to see who is developed and who is underdeveloped, we can compare countries to compare levels of development. We use what they call national income statistics. These days we have GDP normally used, which means gross domestic product, but we also have GMP, gross national product, and GNI. GDP actually doesn't tell the full picture, because GMP, gross national product, will actually remove what is exported abroad by foreign countries from your GDP. So if you have a GDP, which I will talk about later, like Nigeria has some GDP, but we always forget that a lot of the so-called GDP is actually exported out of Nigeria. So the real picture of what Nigeria has is actually less than the GDP can suggest for you. And then if you look at the GDP of the US, if you do not include what they are taking from other countries, it also doesn't tell the full picture. Of course, we have to look at this thing in terms of the number of people in a country, the population, for it to be a correct comparison. Because one country can have many billions of people and one with only several thousands. So to compare their GDP doesn't make sense. You have to use their national income. You have to use the national income per capita. Of course, the idea for the capitalist economists is that if you look at GDP per capita, it can do some comparison. But that actually cannot account for the vast inequalities that you have. Your GDP can take all the Dangote and the rich billionaires' income and say that's an average income, but that's a lie when the majority of the population are in poverty. So GDP per capita does not tell the full story. So Rodney compares income per capita for 1965 to 1968 in how Europe underdeveloped Africa. We look at the rich countries of the world like Canada, the USA, France, United Kingdom, and you see Africa as a whole. If you compare Africa in 1965 to United Kingdom in 1967, the gap isn't so big. 1,400, United Kingdom is 1,560. See? So I say it doesn't tell the full picture because we don't look at what the United Kingdom is taking at the time from Africa or whatever. But anyway, the gap isn't so much. You look at the individual countries from Congo, Ghana, South Africa, you see they're quite small relative to the big countries. But now let's compare it in 2019. United States, $65,000. Africa as a whole has hardly moved from 1,400 to 2,700. Hardly moved, despite the fact that the population, has been growing and other things have been happening. So the GDP per capita for Africa has hardly moved. The USA has moved significantly, and the gap has significantly widened. If you look at the country like Nigeria, the GDP is not going to tell you that, for example, our telecommunications makes up a significant amount of our GDP, the profits of telecommunications, but we know where the profits are going to. Now the profits are going to South Africa or to Dubai, and so on in all sectors. So we're actually poorer than this statistic can tell us. So Rodney discusses, if we compare growth rates at the time the book was written, socialist countries had the highest growth, followed by developed capitalist countries, with colonies and ex-colonies far behind. Proportion of international trade, which is a key way of measuring how well a country or continent is doing, has also been falling for Africa. Africa's proportion of international trade has been falling. And today now, if we look at it now, the countries with the fastest growth, or the country with the fastest growth, is China, which is a socialist country that operates what we call a market economy, but a restricted capitalist economy. So it still remains the case if you want to look at it. Vietnam is also doing very well in following that model. The big capitalist countries are growing slower than countries with some socialist policies or whatever. Meanwhile, today now is even worse. The colonies, ex-colonies are far, 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 far behind, and yet we have been told that we have to follow a particular model of development. So when we look at international trade, which is significant for why Africa is behind, we look at it from 1948 to 2015, the developing economies, so-called developing economies, have grown very strongly. Well, that is because of countries like China, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. Developed economies have fallen as a share. But Africa, should Africa not be growing from 7% in 1948, when it was still under colonization, to 7% in 1953, to 2% today, and it has been falling. Between 1983 and 2015, Africa's share of international trade has fallen. Advanced and newly industrialized economies have better technology and know-how. They have manufacturing industries, access to finance, and more market than Africa. Therefore, they have a greater market proportion in world trade. On the other hand, Africa's global share of merchandise trade has reduced over the decades. This is, as we all know, partly because the continent has concentrated on the exportation of few primary commodities, mineral fuels like crude oil, iron ore, gold, cocoa beans, and the prices are being determined in the global markets, as well as the demand. So, when we look at it, for the top 5 African countries, South Africa has been falling, Nigeria has been falling, Algeria has been falling, Angola falling, well, a little bit, Morocco down. So that's the trend since 1983 at least. So often, people speak about Africa having an advantage in terms of being an agricultural economy. But if we look at industrialization and agriculture, we know the advanced countries are where they are because they are industrialized. They have advanced technology and skills, but they also have more advanced agriculture. They also have more advanced agriculture. Rodney says, to quote, the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are called agricultural countries because they rely on agriculture and have little or no industry. But their agriculture is unscientific and the yields are far less than those of the developed countries. In fact, in several of the largest underdeveloped nations, there was stagnation and fall in agricultural output in and after 1966. If we want to compare level of development in other areas, social services, education, healthcare, one measure. Basic food requirements, African countries fall far behind there too. When we look at basic food requirements, we look at low calories per day. We're having low calories per day, and we have protein farming. So even if we have consuming calories in terms of carbohydrates, we're not consuming enough protein. Life expectancy is low. There's a low number of doctors per person, and of course, brain drain. Now, Rodney was writing in the 50s to the 60s. You can imagine what the brain drain is now. In fact, very soon we won't have any doctors left. We will just have to go to the village doctor. That's where we are now, and that's how it's going. But all these things are quantitative measurements. They are not enough to gauge development. We have to look at qualitative assessments as to how the economy is put together to understand, you know, how a developed country works versus what is wrong with an underdeveloped country. First of all, you're going to have a food processing sector, which is going to help you to have healthy workers and a surplus of food, which you can sell for profit. Your healthy workers are going to work in your industrial sector. They're going to build your steel and your electric power. I was actually reading earlier today about the Soviet Union. You know, when the Soviet Union started, there was this thing about collectivizing agriculture. Actually, the same thing for China. That was a priority these countries pushed to collectivize so that they could make enough food for the people who are going to work in the industrial sectors. So they understood very early the need to do that, to tie those two things together. Of course, the industrial sector, the basic steel, electric power is going to give you machinery for industry, but it's also going to give you the machinery for agriculture, which you need to make a food processing sector. So they all are interrelated and benefit at one another. Now, recently, of course, everybody knows these things, right? The government of Buhari is trying to tell us that we shouldn't be importing rice. So they want to focus on food, which should be good, right? But in doing that, they forget that you need machinery in order to make rice. You need water. And how do you get the water? Through, you know, components of pumping and electric power. You don't just make rice just by saying you want to do it, putting fertilizer and doing it some old way. If you abandon your industrial sector, what is the point of wasting everybody's time with just pretending, which is what they are doing, and fooling everybody? And the reality is, with all the rice that they produce, most of the rice still consumed is smuggled rice, because it's not possible to do things like that. But a lot of people get fooled by this. From the very beginning of when they've been shouting they want to do rice, I keep on saying, well, it's not going to happen, never. Not with the lack of machinery, which you are still importing. So don't import rice, but import machinery, which you are still going to pay dollars for. So what is the point? So to quote Rodney, it is typical of underdeveloped countries that they do not or are not allowed to concentrate on those sectors of the economy They are not allowed, note that. It's not that they are not doing it or they don't want to, that there's some reason it's not being happening. They are not allowed to. By who, we should ask? To concentrate on those sectors of the economy, which in turn will generate growth and raise production to a new level altogether. And there are very few ties between one sector and another, so that, say, agriculture and industry could react beneficially on each other. Now, in terms of talking about not being allowed, which we shall come into, during the colonial period, the only thing the African countries were good for was cash crops, until the discovery of oil and other minerals and so on, which they used, and the whole infrastructure. Some people say, well, the colonialists should come back and recolonize, it will be better. Better how? When they were here, the infrastructure they developed was so that they could take the cash crops to the port and send it overseas. They were not interested in tying agriculture to industry, and they are still not interested in Africa having a tie between agriculture and industry. It is very important we understand this, to understand what imperialism is, and the fact that they do not allow. We'll come back to that. So now I'm going to play a video. Okay, not yet. Continue with characteristics of underdeveloped countries. So as we all know, all the savings made are sent abroad. They are not spent on production, but on consumption. Our money is just constantly flowing abroad. And anything we spend here is on champagne and moe and whatever else. There's a heavy focus on paying for auxiliary services, like the civil service, the army, that's what a lot of money gets spent on, rather than development of industry. So in describing an underdeveloped country, we find that a high disproportion of wealth goes to a privileged few. Instead, and this privileged few are the politicians, the civil servants, and those who are allowed to, to have some control over aspects of the economy, not the industrial aspects as such, just the food aspects and so on. So that is how we look at our economy. And of recent, I've noticed this trend with Nigerian government. They always talk about raising taxes to fund the economy. They just they don't have enough money, they keep on saying. So they have to take taxes. They have to take taxes. Rodney, to quote Rodney, he says, taxes do not produce national wealth and development. Wealth has to be produced out of nature, from tilling the land or mining metals or felling trees, or turning raw materials into finished products for human consumption. These things are done by the vast majority of the population, who are peasants and workers. And in this whole tax thing, now the idea is that you cannot build a road if you don't put a toll gate. Or if you give Dangote tax concessions, you'll build a road. But you know what that means? Is an indirect way of taxing the people. Everything they think about is to tax the people. But if you are taxing people for roads and what, but you are not getting the economy to move in terms of industry, in terms of agriculture, then there is no wealth that is being created. You are just recycling the small amount of money and taking it from the poor and basically making the poor poorer. That is this whole idea about raising taxes to fund the economy. Taxes are only a small part or a part of what you do by producing. That is how the West raise taxes. Taxes don't just come out of thin air, but it seems to be the mentality of our government ever from time. So we come to what we call the underdevelopment paradox. Africa is rich in resources, yet poor. I just want to play a video about that topic while I have a drink of water. So look at this video.
The poverty that we see throughout the third world, those people struggling in Group B, many of them falling into Group C, the hundreds of millions of them, that poverty is not an original historical condition. It was imposed by colonizing forces. Walter Rodney, who was assassinated, Walter Rodney wrote an interesting book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I always thought the title, the use of the word underdeveloped as a verb, was very important and very revealing. That it was something that was done to Africa. Africa wasn't underdeveloped. There were rich cultures there. Africa is a rich continent. Latin America is a rich continent. Asia is a rich continent. The imperialists, the colonialists, don't go to poor places. They go to rich places. They go in there to take their markets, to take their oil, their timber, their cotton, their hemp, their flax, their gold, their silver, their diamonds, and 1,000 other things. And they go in there to exploit and ruthlessly exploit their labor. That's why you go, Africa is rich, only its people are poor. And there's still problems in Africa today. There's still outrageous things going on in Africa. Building their own pharmaceutical factories in the Sudan. Where do you get off thinking you can do that when you should be buying pharmaceuticals from the multinational pharmaceuticals? Owning your own land. A lot of the land in Africa is still in the village economy. Collectively run, often, by the way, run and worked by women. In collectives. They got no business running that land. That's our land. That's our land. That belongs to us. The agribusiness multinationals will get that land. That's what Clinton was doing in Africa last year. He was letting them know there's going to be a GATT for Africa. A GATT. When I was a kid in the old gangster movies, a GATT was a gun you held to somebody's head. Indeed. Getting worked up here. So the goal is to deracinate the population. That is, get them off the land, de-skill them, and then force them to work at subsistence wages. Take the case of India. India was a rich, advanced, developed country. Until the British went in 1800. And between 1800 and 1830, the Indian textile industry, which was outperforming the British textile industry in exports and quality, was dismantled. And between 1840 and the whole balance of trade was shifted. The great textile centers of Dhaka and Madras were de-industrialized, and the people were sent back out on the land to grow cotton for the factories in Manchester and London. And between 1850 and 1900, the Indian per capita income fell by 65%. So that poverty in the third world, that so-called underdevelopment, these so-called developing nations that are now beginning, like little children, learning how to walk, and we will help them along. These countries are not underdeveloped. They were overexploited. They're maldeveloped.
Okay, so I want to come back to something important you said there about textiles, which we can relate to our own situation here. So to quote Rodney, in order to understand present economic conditions in Africa, one needs to know why it is that Africa has realized so little of its natural potential. And one also needs to know why so much of its present wealth goes to non-Africans who reside for the most part outside of the continent. It's very important. And the reason we're doing this, I have to say, because a lot of people have interacted with, including Pan-Africanists, socialists, and so on, is like people don't want to know what costs or what causes Africa's underdevelopment. And you have to wonder, when they get into power, what will be the result? So we really have to understand what is the cause of the present economic condition in Africa. So what explains the paradox? According to Western ideologies, they say it is God-given. Rodney talked about a quote, a Western intellectual goes on about those who have not. Who's a biblical person here? Those who have not will not be, we have less, and for those who it is given, we have more. So it's an idea, it's a racist idea, you know, that the West is innately superior. Again, I should just say very quickly that that was Michael Parenti in the video, and he's going to explain a lot of this later as well. I'm going to play another video where he gives a very good explanation and summary of the whole thing. You know, the West is innately superior, or Africans are lazy. The sun is too hot. Or they will tell you that you people in Africa, you just lack skilled personnel. Okay, we lack skilled personnel. But how do we do anything about it? That is like using the consequence of our situation as a cause for our situation. It is not because we lack skilled personnel that we're where we are, but we lack skilled personnel because of where we are, because of the exploitation that has been imposed on us. In other places, some people will tell you corruption and so on, as if corruption is inbred in African people, rather than corruption being a consequence of what has happened. So in studying this, not just Western ideologies, but the people in Africa who copy or who do not want to think beyond the boundaries of just looking at consequences rather than looking at a system and relationship. They never examine the relationship of exploitation. So, quote Rodney again, the people of Africa and other parts of the colonized world have gone through a cultural and psychological crisis and have accepted, at least partially, the European version of things. That means that the African himself has doubts about his capacity to transform and develop his natural environment. With such doubts, he even challenges those of his brothers who say that Africa can and will develop through the efforts of its own people. If we can determine when underdevelopment came about, it would dismiss the lingering suspicion that it is racially or otherwise predetermined and that we can do little about it. Relationship of expectation. This is normal, right? To a certain extent. As human beings develop, they exploited nature. Then other human beings exploited other human beings. In all stages of development, you know, we went through part of how this happens in the first section. With the example of early China and its development. After a point at which there's an increase in surplus, you know, there's a tendency for the people put in charge of administrating things to become, you know, exploitative. That doesn't mean, you know, it cannot be checked and controlled, but that's the reality. Then we also have nations exploiting nations. Trade is a means of exploitation under capitalism. We have unequal exchange in the trade relationship. That's in importing and exporting. Take an example of Uganda. Uganda exports coffee. It's its #1 export commodity. It doesn't consume coffee as such. It exports it. But anybody who works on growing coffee earns less than 10 cents on every dollar that is spent in the advanced nations of coffee. Less than 10 cents is much worse. So the people making the coffee actually don't benefit from it. Don't benefit much from it. So looking at this now, in the relationship of exploitation to trade, Rodney says, when the terms of trade are set by one country in a manner entirely advantageous to itself, then the trade is usually detrimental to the trading partner. You can take the export of agricultural produce from Africa and the import of manufactured goods into Africa from Europe, North America, and Japan. The big nations establish the price of the agricultural products and subject these prices to frequent reductions. At the same time, the price of manufactured goods is also set by them, along with the freight rates necessary for trade in the ships of those nations. The minerals of Africa also fall into the same category as agricultural produce as far as pricing is concerned. The ownership of means of production is by foreigners in this, as part of this relationship of exploitation. When we go beyond trade now, under colonialism, the foreigners own the lands and the mines directly. Now, even though they are not directly present, foreigners still own much land, mines, oil, oil fields, banks, factories, power stations. This foreign investment ensures that natural resources and labor produce economic value that is taken away from Africa. So, as I said earlier, it's not just the question of Africans paying debt overseas, but actually sending profits overseas by not owning the means of production in their own country. But when we look at debt, of course, it's common to say, debt is a measure of how they are taken out of Africa, because they have used this debt to entrap Africa and to make sure Africa has to keep on going, begging, and so on. But it's important to emphasize that it's not just debt. So when we talk about debt these days, we talk about, is there a new imperialist in town? When Rodney was writing in the 50s and 60s, he said, Africa trades mainly with the countries of Western Europe, North America, and Japan. Africa is also diversifying its trade by dealing with socialist countries. And if that trade proves disadvantageous to the African economy, then the developed socialist countries will also have joined the ranks of the exploiters of Africa. Now, the big elephant in the room is China, and we must discuss it. This is like Rodney asking the question back then, that this scenario, a scenario might develop. So we have to look at it. Rodney says, however, it is very essential at this stage to draw a clear distinction between the capitalist countries and the socialist ones, because socialist countries have never at any time owned any part of the African continent, nor do they invest in African economies in such a way as to expatriate profits from Africa. Therefore, socialist countries are not involved in the robbery of Africa. That was talking then. Now, there's a lot of belief that China, by this debt issue, is taking out profits. And I will argue very strongly that China has not invested in African economies in such a way as to expatriate profits from Africa. Certainly no way close to how the Western imperialists have done it and still do it. In fact, the Chinese mentality seems to be to build relationships as it struggles in a world in which it is competing with the United States, and it's actually, China too falls under the sphere of American imperialism. It's trying to escape the trap of imperialism itself. It's actually itself still a victim in a way that people don't seem to understand, and it's actually looking to build alliances in Africa. But let's look at this debt thing that keeps on being stated as the reason why China is imperialist. If you look at who owns China, there's actually the key African countries there: Niger, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Angola, Kenya. Percentage of their total debt is not even up to 50% for most cases. So it's still, the debt is still held by the Western imperialists or Western sources. Africa, I'm quoting somebody, Africa does not have a debt problem with China. Oftentimes we hear that there's an African debt crisis with China, but only about 10 African countries have a debt problem with China. That leaves a majority of countries that do not have a debt problem with China. China's debt trap diplomacy is often described as a long-term goal to entrap African nations in debt commitments they cannot fulfill, and ultimately leverage that pretext to obtain resources, commodities, or key assets. But data from Rodney Group, a New York-based economic and policy research firm, suggests otherwise. We continue to find very limited evidence that China's policy banks have wiped away bilateral debt in exchange for control of strategic assets. The firm said in its latest report, this is in 2019. You know, the evidence, the thing is that in MAE, we encourage people to look at evidence and making conclusions. Look at the evidence very solid. There's a lot of propaganda, which is understandable from the American side, you know, and it's really on overdrive. And it's easy for people to buy into all the stories, but you find, you know, in fact, what happens is that the debt constantly being renegotiated. It never really comes to the point of anything being taken. And there are other aspects in terms of infrastructure development, which is not being the European style, which is to give you some money to ensure that your raw materials continue to come, but not really to develop the country. That to actually see infrastructure that could be developing the country in terms of whether it's even industry or whatever. And so there's a lot of evidence out there that people just ignore. It's not possible to discuss all of these things. But one key thing I have to say is that, you know, there's this whole debt thing and investment thing. It's not just something that is done by just writing agreements and just negotiating debt and so on. The Western imperialism backed by the American guns is a gun-based imperialism, debt imperialism. So essentially, it goes into countries with guns. And if you have any country that wants to develop through socialism, which is the model that, you know, people feel will work, we have had at least 20 African leaders assassinated in the last, I would say, 60 years or so, or in the last 40 years. I'm not sure the figure. You know, so this thing is backed with guns. It is aggressive. And there's also a lot of these discussions and misunderstanding of imperialism. Yes, debt is a factor, but that is having debt relationships is not actually what constitutes imperialism. What is the source of wealth of the industrialized countries is a key question we have to ask. Rodney says, it is absolutely necessary to determine whether the standard of living in a given industrialized country is a product of its own internal resources, or whether it stems from exploiting other countries. The United States has a small proportion of the world's population and exploitable natural wealth, but it enjoys a huge percentage of the wealth which comes from exploiting the labor and natural resources of the whole world. In fact, these countries were built on exploitation, and that is what constitutes their wealth. You know, and we also have to understand that capitalism has reached a stage called imperialism, which is actually characterized by what is called financial capitalism. I'm actually reading something very recently that, you know, we in fact, American capitalism now is no longer industrial capitalism. In a stage, it's now referred to as a neo-feudal state, which basically is financial capitalism. It is about going to countries with the big capital it has, putting into real estate and so on, make prices rise, or buying stocks, make the prices rise and take the profits, and condemn people to basically to misery because people have to pay more for housing, they have to pay more for a lot of things. In fact, they're actually doing that to their own citizens. You know, Obama was a key factor in enabling this, the banking elements in the United States to actually exploit their own citizens, to make them homeless, and to drive up the price of land. So this is a very predatory capitalism. And in fact, China had to accept, accept these financiers into its economy, because China does try to control what happens in its economy. So the banks in China, for example, are not private, because once you make banks private, they become very predatory. And China actually had to accept these financiers because the American guns are actually stationed outside China right now. And China felt that if it can placate the financiers who actually finance the political parties in America, they will now, maybe stop the war on China, which is the plan of the Americans. So there's not enough time to go into all this for me to make my own point. But I think there's a lot of lack of evidence and lack of actually analysis of what imperialism is. And I actually recommend people read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capital, which highest stage of capitalism, which explains imperialism as being characterized by financial capitalism. And this is the capitalist market system, this imperialist system that we are dealing with now. Africa is firmly within the capitalist market system through trade, colonial domination, and capitalist investment. Its participation in this system explains its underdevelopment. It loses its wealth created from its labor and resources to the Western capitalist countries. It has been restricted from developing its capacity to make maximum use of its economic potential. Again, we come back to the fact that Africa is not allowed to develop its capacity. Just to give an example, because we keep on talking about debts, but the debts that Nigerian government signed up with the IMF and the World Bank of recent says that if you are going to collect this money, you are going to increase the price of oil, you are going to increase the price of electricity, you are going to increase the cost of education. We've had the structural adjustment programs, to force Africa to structurally be unable to escape from within the place where it has been put. Just give us cheap labor, cheap raw materials. Give us, your wealth. It is actually a policy, a proactive policy worked on within the system to keep Africa in place. It is called, according to Rodney, a structural dependency. Africa's integration into the structure of capitalist economies is disadvantageous for Africa and ensures its continuing dependence. Structural dependence is one of the characteristics of underdevelopment. So within this idea of structural dependency, we have the metropole, which is the capitalist, advanced capitalist, imperialist states. And we have the satellites who depend on that and basically revolve around it. Like the moon goes around the earth by force of nature. So we can't break free. We are integrated into this. Another way of looking at it is that the imperialist countries known as the core, and the colonial countries, the countries that are colonized or neo-colonized, are known as the periphery. And from the core, we have high profit consumption goods going to the periphery, and from the periphery, we have the cheap labor and raw materials going to the core. Of course, we have some countries who are semi-periphery trying to escape in that sense. And so, like for example, you can say in respect China and other countries who are still being caught in this trap of the imperialists. So it's a world system, and within that world system, at the base of it, the top of it, is the key imperialists with the big guns. The Americans who police on behalf of all imperialists, Western European imperialists. So any country that is dependent can never be considered developed. Developed countries are also dependent on the exploited in a way because they control, because of course they depend on us for their raw materials, but they control the relationship and can even end it in whatever sphere they want when they want. Therefore, there's no hope of development until the cycle of exploitation and dependence is broken. Now, of course, all countries have to be mutually interdependent. Structural dependency is not denying that fact. We have to do trade with other countries. We have to rely on other countries, and we can have a relationship. Yes, we can have a relationship with China. We can have a relationship with countries. The issue is that economic independence requires a capacity to exercise choice in external relations and self-reliance. Now, Rodney gives an example of synthetic fabrics, which synthetic fabrics, which you know, which my co-parenting mentioned with regards to India. And we all know what happened to our fabrics in Nigeria here. They come now from China and from the Dutch, and there's no way our textile industry is destroyed. So this is exactly what situation we are in. We also have now, and it is crucial to imperialism, cultural imperialism. At the very beginning, it is you know, which is the other means of keeping Africa tied to the capitalist system through social and cultural means. We have the Christian church. Rodney tried to establish that it doesn't mean independent Christian churches in Africa, but the Christian church being dominated from overseas and the whole mentality and ideology being very Europeanized and foreign. Education is another means, of course. Of course, the education produces Africans to service the capitalist system and to subscribe to its values. Language, of course, we have to communicate, you know, in the imperialist language, essentially, even among ourselves. Music, as we all know. In fact, it will be difficult to find a sphere that did not reflect the structural dependence and integration. So we have the economic sphere, we have the cultural sphere, the food, the cartoons our children watch, everything really. So now we come to neo-colonialism. Franz Fanon discusses very well those puppets who serve as the transmission line between the metropole and the dependencies in Africa. So in a system of neo-colonialism where the colonialist is not directly present, they have to have intermediaries, they have to have agents, and that is, you know, those who are puppets. The importance of this minority group of puppets cannot be underestimated. It is part of the definition of underdevelopment that the group of sellouts exists, because of course you don't have independence if you have some people betraying you from within to ensure you are continuing to be enslaved by others. And in a way of looking at neo-colonialism, we can consider what we discussed before about European slavery. You know, it's a system of basically making slavery less direct, but slavery still exists. So we move to feudalism, which is still a form of slavery, but the people who are enslaved believe they are free, because slavery at the end of the day was more expensive to run. So colonialism, in a sense, was becoming more expensive to run, you know, and so we have an indirect level of slavery, you know, that we have now. Another characteristic of underdevelopment or a chronic symptom is political instability. If economic power is centered outside Africa, then political and military power is also centered outside. We can't understand this phenomenon without understanding it as deriving from imperialism. You know, we see this political instability, again, we tend to look at it often like it's just a characteristic of Africans. But actually it happens because there are some powers outside who constantly interfere and encourage the instability, encourage different powers. You know, we had a period of military coups, you know, which haven't ended, as you have seen in Mali, and you know, and Rodney talks about Latin America and Asia under imperialism constantly being unstable, one military coup after the other. It's a characteristic of imperialism. It's not the characteristics of Africans. So in conclusion, who and what is responsible for African underdevelopment? When we look at the what, as we explained, it is the imperialist system. Who are the who? They are the capitalists who manipulate the system, and their agents, unwitting their agents or unwitting accomplices. We also have unwitting accomplices, people who buy into the ideology, you know. So now, and this imperialist system, of course, the workers of the West have also benefited from it, not just the capitalists, because the capitalists have taken the super wealth, the super profits they've made from Africa and used it to bribe their own working people so that people will not protest and, and will not turn against them. So, I'm ending here. Of course, we're going to play a video from Michael Parenti again to summarize, but I just really have to emphasize, some people don't think it's actually necessary to discuss this book. They think we are wasting our time. And I think actually anybody that doesn't discuss it should not be trusted with the position of power. Anybody that doesn't take what comes out of this book seriously should not be trusted with the position of power. It is necessary for those who struggle to have an understanding of the system under which they are with. Otherwise, they are going to repeat the same mistakes and be caught in the same traps. And Rodney has said in the first chapter that there's no country that was previously underdeveloped or caught in the imperialist system who escaped, who now use capitalism to develop. And some people might look at countries like China and Vietnam and say they're capitalists. No, there's a way in which the Chinese state is rigidly controlled in order to ensure that this kind of super exploitation of capitalism does not occur. So if in any case we in Africa are not going to go into the ideology of socialism with the mindset of how we industrialize our countries and we want to be trapped, what the imperialists call comparative advantage. It's very, you guys, you can't industrialize, you're useless. Just continue to send raw materials. So if we remove Buhari now, the next person is just going to concentrate on making more cocoa, more oil, more this, more that. Even if they will tell them now, don't go into making clothes for yourself. It's cheaper to bring it in from China. These are the things that will happen. And then if the leaders are not actually going to be engaged in understanding not to do this, then Africa will continue to be where it is. It's not just simply a changing of leadership, just having some so-called good leaders. It depends on what are the characteristics of the leaders. So, Rodney says the ultimate responsibility. We are not saying that it's just we're giving everything. We are saying the West is now responsible to free itself from Africa, or we are blaming everything on the West. According to Rodney, ultimate responsibility rests with us Africans. Not only are there African accomplices inside the imperialist system, but every African has a responsibility to understand the system and work for its overthrow. So we've been discussing what is the myth of underdevelopment. It is a myth. People are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. I think this is a very good summary of the whole concept again from Michael Parenti.
This is Radio Truth, a series of commentaries by Dr. Michael Parenti. Michael Parenti is an activist and internationally known award-winning author and scholar. His recent books include The Assassination of Julius Caesar and Superpatriotism. His latest book, The Culture Struggle, will be released in November 2005. For further information, please visit his website, michaelparenti.org.
The myth of underdevelopment. Why are Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, those areas known as the Third World, why are they so much poorer than Europe, North America, and Japan? When I was a kid, I heard that these poor regions were poor because of their climate. It was just so hot and nobody could get to do anything, and people were really lazy. In fact, the climate in many of these areas is beautiful, even when it's severe and people work very hard. None of them are lazy. I also heard that these poor populations have too many children, that they're backward in their cultures and just too easygoing. Everything was mañana, mañana. In fact, these countries were very advanced cultures, many of them. They didn't really have too many children, or let's say the children were not the cause of their poverty, but a result of the poverty. And in fact, these areas are not poor, they're rich in resources. This explains why Walter Rodney titled his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is, he used the word underdeveloped as a verb. In country after country, when European and North American investment came in, the people did not become more prosperous, they ended up becoming poorer. This was true in Argentina, Brazil, North Africa, Southwest Africa, Vietnam. You can go all over the world and you'll find that whenever the foreign investors came in, they made money for themselves and the people ended up poorer, their resources depleted, their environment destroyed, and their futures also destroyed. The third world is poor because it's been expropriated for centuries by the imperial interests of Europe, North America, and Japan. So underdevelopment really isn't an original historical condition. Underdevelopment is the result of overexploitation. For centuries, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America have had their lands plundered, their markets have been monopolized, their populations dislocated, decimated, overworked, and underpaid when they could get work. So what we really have is not underdevelopment, but a historically imposed maldevelopment. You have in many of these countries superhighways that go from the latifundia and the mines to the ports, but you have no roads for the people up in the backcountry so that they might be able to see a doctor or teacher or something. You have in many of these countries exquisite plastic surgery clinics for the rich, but no hospitals for the poor. You have luxury high-rises in many of these countries, in their cities, with luxury offices and all that stuff. And meanwhile, the ordinary people live in shanty towns. You have enormous wealth in the form of export crops and export natural resources, and yet you have domestic poverty and the ruination of local farming and the ruination of local production. So what's called the developing nations really aren't developing. They're declining more and more. After the Cold War, there have been cutbacks in aid. No more developing. Now they're called failed nations. What is a failed nation? It's a nation that has been crushed by these dominant investment interests. The goal today is the third worldization of the entire world, including the United States itself. So what's called underdevelopment is not a neutral, natural phenomenon. It is historically linked to another historical global phenomenon, and that is called imperialism. This is Michael Parenti for Radio Truth.